Hello, Old Testament 1 evening students. You get to join me tonight in my kids' playroom. You can see by the beautiful color on the walls. And my kids are in bed, so I could actually make this. Um, so tonight, or today, whenever you're watching this or listening, we're going to cover Leviticus and Numbers and answer the same questions that we did for our previous lectures on Genesis and Exodus. So, really, the who, what, when, where, and why of the letters or the books that were written, and a lot of them theological message that we'll get from it, kind of why it's significant, why each specific book is significant for the canon of Scripture. So I don't want to waste your time, and so we're going to jump right into it. Let's start by talking about Leviticus. Now, for Leviticus and Numbers, it's important to remember that they really are seen as part of a bigger whole, which would be the Pentateuch, right? You've heard that word enough times now. Pentateuch is the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And they're never really seen as anything other than meant to be a collection. And that's why, for the most part, most people believe that Moses would be the primary author for all 5 of those books. I believe we've talked about this. Most people probably would say there were some edits that were made, like when we look at Numbers, and we read this last week in class. It would have been really hard for Moses to write about himself that he was the most humble man on earth. That's kind of a weird thing to write if you are the most humble man on earth. So in terms of who, if we were going to answer the question of who for Leviticus, the primary who would be Moses would be understood as the author. And so we can understand Moses as the author with probably some additions. But for the most part, it's Moses. And then to whom it would be the Israelites. And just like the rest of Genesis and Exodus that we talked about, this would be the Israelites in the wilderness. So wandering for 40 years between exiting Egypt and entering the Promised Land. So that's kind of who the primary message is. It's different than Genesis. Genesis, we said, was a lot of oral tradition, right? Hearing the stories, knowing the stories of the faith, knowing the stories of where the earth began, how it got to where it is, who it was that God spoke to. So collecting all those stories and then putting them into a book called Genesis, right? Or like we heard in Hebrew, in the beginning. And then Exodus would have been a lot more of recent history, remembering what was happening. Leviticus and Numbers was while it's happening. You know, it was written, obviously not written exactly, not like a news reporter who's sitting there and writing things down. Some of it might have been because God was speaking the law to Moses, and so Moses would have recorded that as it was given to, excuse me. But the who and to whom, Moses to the Israelites. When it was written, we answered that during the 40 years in the wilderness, and that's the same. When it was written is pretty close to when it was happening. And so, and that's, I guess now that we're, we'll see. For a lot of books, that's pretty not too uncommon now. I mean, even in the New Testament, the Gospels were not written too long after what happened. Where it happened, the wilderness. But really, we'll mention this later, but a lot of Leviticus is what God spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting. You'll notice that there was reference to the tent of meeting, and that's where a lot of what was given to Moses from God would have come to him. Why was it written? Similar to Genesis and Exodus, God told Moses to write things down. It was meant to speak to the Israelites to help them remember what happened, and it was written to lay out the expectations. I'm sorry, I will stop yawning, I promise. It was to lay out the expectations of what it looks like to live in covenant with God. A covenant is a legal binding contract, and it wouldn't have been an uncommon thing in that day and age for covenants to be written down when they were made between two people that knew reading and writing. And since Moses was in the camp and the people of Israel were moving away from slavery more toward a nation that would have more people, priests, who would read and write, it's important to write it down. So let's talk a little bit about what is involved in the book of Leviticus. First, the name Leviticus comes from the Septuagint. The Septuagint is a word that you'll probably hear a few times in Old Testament studies. And what the Septuagint is the pre-Christian Greek translation of the Old Testament. So it was created when Greek was becoming the more common language. So much later than Leviticus was actually written. But when Greek was becoming the more primary language for the world, right, when the Romans and the Greek empires would have been spreading, they were trying to, the process is called Hellenization, to make every civilization feel more like Greece. And so part of that was translating all their important documents, and the Hebrew Scriptures would have been one of those. So it was created to help the Israelites, the nation of Israel, feel more Greek. One of the shorthand ways that you'll see it is it will be written in Roman numerals for 70, so LXX, capital, all capitals LXX. It's made because 70 scholars were used to create the Septuagint, or at least that's the story, is that 70 scholars were used to translate the Hebrew to Greek. And the title Leviticus comes from the Septuagint, and what it means is relating to the Levites, which a lot of the writing does. It lays out the expectations for the priests, but it's not exclusive to the Levites, and so it can be easy to read the title and think, or even it can be easy to read the title and think, okay, this has nothing to do with us anymore, but that's not true. What it primarily records is the instructions that the Lord gave Moses from the tent of meeting, like we mentioned. But it does also include a few narratives of a few events related to the tabernacle, which would have been the Lord's. So between the Lord's meeting place with Moses and the Lord's meeting place with the people. And Exodus really started that. Exodus started by laying out the foundation of the tabernacle and how it was to be approached and what it looked like to worship God in the tabernacle. But Leviticus goes into much deeper detail about what the divine-human relationship will look like, that was put in place at Mount Sinai. So God started by speaking to Moses at Mount Sinai and laying it out. Leviticus takes it a step further, and that's kind of, how considerate of God, right? So often we need that, hey, before you give me all the details, why don't you give me the big picture first, and then we could get into the finer details. And so Exodus has kind of the big picture of what does it look like to worship God, and Leviticus gets a little bit more into the details. It really does, when you read it, you can see this. It assumes that Israel is a sinful people, that they're impure, and Leviticus describes how to deal with sin and impurity so that a holy God, the Lord, a holy God, could dwell among his people. And so um, it you'll notice a lot these there's some words that are very significant for the message of Leviticus. A couple of there's really three that would be the most significant. Clean. You'll notice these used repeated over and over. Clean, unclean, and holy. And really, clean and unclean can be understood as are the clean things are within the what would be considered holy. The unclean things would be outside of what is considered holy. Let's see. There we go. I don't claim it to feel awkward in the background, but you get to see my beautiful, a beautiful tent and some beautiful dress-up dresses. And so, what is within the bounds of holiness? What is outside the bounds of holiness? Really, holiness is the major theme of the book, and so we have to understand, in the context of Leviticus, what does holy mean? And really, when we are thinking of in terms of holiness, Leviticus becomes somewhat of a manual. Like it's a manual of regulations established by a holy king that enables him to set up an earthly throne among the people of his kingdom. So it's really like the rules of, hey, if you want me to live as your king, this is what it needs to look like for us to be able to all get along, right? Much in the same way that in the United States we all have certain rules and regulations that we've said this is how we can all get along as a civilization, right? When the light is red, you stop. When the light is green, you go. There's certain things like that it's we drive on the right side of the road, not the left side of the road. There's certain things that it's like we can all agree on. This is how we are going to best live. And for a God who is holy, He's able to say, this is what it looks like to be able to be in my presence. And so in that sense, holiness really means to be separated from sin and set apart exclusively for the Lord, for His purposes and for His glory, right? We've probably heard you've probably heard that before. To be holy means to be set apart. It means that there is something that is different about us, and sometimes that's a hard concept for people to understand. Holiness, like, why is it so important? Like, can't God cut people a break a little bit, right? How come it seems like God is so gracious later, and here there's such a hard line? And there's a good illustration just for understanding, like, what does sin look like in the presence of a holy God. And I think you can think of it somewhat, maybe less emotionally, if that makes sense. So less in terms of, oh man, this is something that just really upsets God. It's kind of, I think it can be easy to think of sin and being unclean as kind of like a pet peeve for God. Like, oh, it just kind of annoys God when people lie, or it annoys God. He could get over it, but it just annoys him. Like for some people, whatever their pet peeve might be, it's a pet peeve when you wear your shoes in the house. Like, should you be banished from the house for wearing your shoes inside? No, but it's somebody's pet peeve, and so you take your shoes off. But it's much more, if you can take the emotion out of it and just think of it almost as a reaction, like the reaction between a fire and flammable gas, right? So if you have fire and you have a balloon full of helium, when you bring those close together, it's not like the fire is upset with the helium, but the helium's going to burn up, right? And so in that sense, that's what it looks like of our sin and God's holiness. God is a holy fire. And when our sinfulness approaches that holiness, the reaction is that we are going to burn up. And so God is setting out regulations of this is what it looks like for you to live in holiness, to stay clean, so that when my holiness is present in your community, in um, in your dwelling, it the reaction is not bad for you, right? And so, in a lot of ways, God laying out holy regulations is an act of grace to us, so that we are able to survive in His presence. Um, why are these regulations important? As we look at Leviticus, and there seems to be a lot of, okay, if somebody's got a growth on their skin, if there's a discharge of fluid, there's a lot it's like, man, this is going into a lot of detail. The book of Leviticus lays out for the people of Israel a symbol, right? That spiritual holiness is symbolized by physical perfection. And so it's showing that set apartness, that we can't just let anything approach God's presence. We serve a perfect and holy God, and so He's deserving of perfect and holy things, set apart things. And so that's why the book demands perfect animals for sacrifice. It requires priests without defect, that if it's going to represent God, it needs to be perfect in the way we can understand it. I think it's a great commentary on our culture of excellence, that if we are going to put forth something that represents God, we cannot achieve perfection, but we want it to appear as close to perfect as possible, as a way of saying, okay, this is how we are going to represent God. God is a perfect God. We cannot perfectly represent Him, but we will strive to. So that's kind of like the major themes of the book of Leviticus. And I had put out a great outline that I did not complete. So you don't need to worry. If we were going to jump to the book of Numbers, the who is, again, the same as Genesis. So Moses is writing to the people of Israel. Excuse me, I'm going to see if I could find my outline real quick, because I have it set right to the side. This is bad teaching right here. I apologize. I had it all set aside, and I was typing too quickly. All right, quickly, an outline for Leviticus. So, chapters 1 through 7 are going to focus on the 5 main offerings. So, chapter 1 is the burnt offering. Chapter 2 is the grain offering. Chapter 3 is the fellowship offering. Chapter 4 through part of 4:1 through 5:13 is the sin offering. And then 5:14 through 6:7 are the 5 verse 14 through 6 verse 7 is the guilt offering. And then 6 verse 8 through the end of 7 are some additional regulations for the offering. Chapters 8 through 10 speak on the installation and ministry of Aaron and his sons, so setting forth the priesthood. Chapters 11 through 15 give the distinctions between clean and unclean, and like we said, that's really representation of being within holiness and outside of holiness. Chapter 16 speaks on the Day of Atonement, an annual Day of Atonement. Chapters 17 through 26 give regulations on holy living. It could be understood as the first half of the book speaks on ritual holiness, and the second half of the book speaks on ethical holiness. Really the ethic of how do we live out the representation of holiness. And then chapter 27, the last chapter, would be regulations for offerings vowed to the Lord. So there's a brief outline for the book of Leviticus, just if we were going to try to structure it. Talking about, getting back to the book of Numbers, right? Moses writing to the Israelites during the 40 years of wilderness, in the wilderness. But really, where it's happening is the long journey from Sinai to the edge of the promised land to 40 years wandering into the wilderness, back to the edge of the promised land. Why is, again, the same as the rest of the Pentateuch. God told Moses to write it down, and then Moses was recording for the sake of the Israelites. It's important for people to know their history. So what's happening in the book of Numbers? Again, the English name of the book comes from the Septuagint, which we talked about, and it's really based on the fact that there's a census that happens. So we find the number of the nation, right? The Hebrew title is a little more descriptive if we were going to read it in Hebrew, and the word for the Hebrew title translates to "in the desert." So it gives a little bit more description of this is what's happening. I don't know, maybe the book of Numbers would feel a lot more appealing for people to read if it was titled something like "In the Desert" as opposed to Numbers. If you're not good at math at all of a sudden a book called Numbers doesn't seem so appealing. But it really tells the journey of Israel, like I mentioned, from Mount Sinai to the borders of the Promised Land. And it really summarizes probably around 50 years of the history of the nation. So Israel had been freed from slavery in Egypt. They received the law, so they received how they would live. The book begins with the people's final preparations to leave Sinai. So they came out of Egypt. Before they could go straight to the promised land, they had to learn who they really were. So they spent time at Sinai, where Moses heard from God and was able to communicate to the people their new way of life. It records really a triumphant sending out or setting out from Sinai before a series of events, right, that you read, in which the people grumbled about the difficulty of the journey and the impossibility of conquering Canaan. So, grumble, grumble, grumble. What a commentary that you could see the miracles of the plagues, crossing the Red Sea, and still not see that God is able to bring you through whatever your situation is. Thankfully, none of us are like that at all. But the response of the people leads God to delay their entry into the promised land by 40 years. And the closing chapters of the book really tell how the people at last set out again and reach the banks of the Jordan, ready to cross into the land promised to their forefathers, which is picked up, the story is picked up in Joshua, but we'll cover that along with Deuteronomy later. The major theme that we can really pick up throughout the book is the gradual fulfillment of the promises to Abraham, that his descendants would be the people of God and would occupy the land of Canaan. The book of Numbers shows the reality of God's presence with Israel in the pillar of cloud and fire over the tabernacle. It also showed how Israel's unbelief can delayed the entry into Canaan and cost many of their lives. But by the end of the book, they're ready to go in, right? And so we can pick up, if we take a look back at Genesis 12, 1 through 3, we could see the four elements of God's promise to Abraham and how it's fulfilled in the book of Numbers, or on its way to being fulfilled, right? So let's read Genesis 12, 1 through 3. It says, "The Lord had said to Abram, 'Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Excuse me. So, the four major parts to that promise that we see fulfilled in the book of Numbers. Number one is the land. So, right, there's a land that God's going to show Abram. And Numbers describes Israel's journey toward that land, toward the promised land. So we're finally hundreds of years after the promise is made to Abraham. The promise is being fulfilled in the land. And it's just saying that makes me wonder. I wonder if you've ever received a promise and you're waiting to see it fulfilled, but God made the promise to you for your descendants to see it. Interesting. Or maybe you are getting to see the promise that God made to one of your ancestors. It's a fun word to use. Second is descendants, right? Abraham had been promised that his descendants would be as many as the stars of heaven. The census in the book shows growth from probably about 70 people, the sons and their wives of Jacob, Israel, that went into Egypt when Joseph was in Egypt, to the hundreds of thousands that go into the promised land. Number three is a covenant relationship with God, right? That God would be with Abram, and God's presence is with the descendants of Abraham is highlighted throughout the book, right? With the pillar of cloud, pillar of fire, the tabernacle itself, God's presence is with them. And then fourth, that Abram would be a blessing to the nations, that he would be blessed to be a blessing, right? And while maybe that's not exactly fulfilled, really most of the Canaanite people would see the Israelites as a curse, not necessarily a blessing. We could see in the story of Balaam how the nation is going to be blessed, and if other nations bless them, they will be blessed themselves, right? And so Balaam was hired to curse Israel, but instead, he says in Numbers 24:9, blessed are those who bless you, and cursed are those who curse you. So Balaam sees the fulfillment of what God speaks to Abraham. Something else that we learn in the book of Numbers, not just that the promise is fulfilled to Abraham, but we learn that the God who entered into covenant with Abraham, the same God that delivered his people from bondage, the same God that brought Israel into covenant with himself, and who revealed his holiness and the graciousness that he would extend by letting people approach him, or showing a way for people to approach him, is also a God of wrath, right? That his anger can flare up, and there are consequences for action, even to the point of Moses, the great prophet, the great leader of the nation, when he disobeys God, experiences God's wrath. That can be a hard thing for people to resolve, right? That we serve a God who can be angry. And maybe this is just my take on it, so take it for what it's worth. Take it or leave it. You could form your own thoughts on it. But I like to think of it in the sense of God is a father to us, right? God is a father to the nation of Israel. And he's the father of all creation, of all humanity. And from the very beginning, God was witness to the pain, the suffering caused to his children by the effects of sin. And so, um, not to say, gosh, I don't want to say that it's not anger, because it is. But it can almost be understood similar to the reaction of if one of my kids was reaching toward a hot stove, my reaction could probably be understood as angry, when a better understanding would be protection. That there is a barrier that God is setting up for the nation of Israel that he is going to hold. And if you try to break that barrier, even though God set it up there for your protection, God will do what he needs to make sure that it stays true. Really, the reason, and we touched on this, the reason that God is with the Israelites is because he is setting up a kingdom for himself on earth. God's entire plan from the very beginning, right? From the moment of sin, God started laying out a plan for people to be returned to a right state with him, to a new Eden. We find out later in Scripture a new heaven and a new earth. God is going to recreate all things without sin and without the temptation of sin, if that makes sense. And so if you are looking to set up a representation of heaven on earth, you don't want hell creeping into it. And so God holds pretty true to the boundary that he sets of holiness for the nation of Israel. And we see that also through the story of Balaam that we read, right? That Balaam is almost rises up in the story as an antagonist to Moses. Moses is God's representative to the people, and Balaam is the representative of the rest of the gods. Balaam would have been a maybe celebrity of his day, and many people knew who he was, and he approached Yahweh, the Lord, the same way that he would have approached any other god in the area. That through magic, through incantations, through doing the right things and following the right procedures, you can put some reins on the god. And Balaam quickly learns that Yahweh, the Lord, cannot be understood like the other gods of the nations. Balaam probably wouldn't have liked that, because even when he attempted to say a curse over the nation, his lips failed him, and he could only utter a blessing. And so we see God setting himself up and setting his kingdom, setting his nation as set apart. It really carries on from Leviticus as set apart from the rest, so that they can be a representation of his kingdom, heaven on earth. It's a good question to ask. I don't know. I don't have a good answer for it, but how does this communicate to our day, to the church of our setting, right? That yes, we are reaching people, and we always want to reach people, make it easy for people far from God to come in. But what does it look like to be a representation of heaven on earth while still on earth, right? It's really the whole be in the world, not of the world. That's a hard thing to figure out, If anybody knows the answer, maybe comment in the discussion board. Okay, quick outline for numbers, and then we'll call this a lecture for the week. And I look forward to seeing everybody's comments on the discussion board. So very quick. First, we see that Israel prepares to enter the promised land. That would be chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 10, verse 10. Then we see the march from Sinai to Kadesh, which would be just outside the promised land, chapter 10, verse 11 to chapter 12, verse 16. After that, we see 40 years near Kadesh, so still outside the promised land, chapter 13, verse 1 through chapter 19, verse 22. Then we see marching from Kadesh to the plains of Moab, chapter 20, verse 1 through 21, verse 35. And then we see Israel in the plains of Moab, so ready to cross, chapter 22, verse 1 through 36, verse 13. So that is Numbers, Leviticus and Numbers in a nutshell. If you have any questions, feel free to either put them on the discussion board or send me an email or save them for the next time we meet as a class. Look forward to meeting with you again shortly. Hope you have a great weekend. Bye.